Well, we probably taught us to menu. Yeah. Establish here rather than talking about getting it right. Right. Yeah. Earlier. I mean, it's just.
I don't know
Okay.
anywhere with that.
To make sure that this doesn't get forgotten.
Yeah.
Send one of us an email.
Yeah. Rather than that. Well, that's what they were saying.
And
Yes.
I promise this will be absolutely the only time you're going to see this happens, but.
You did this presentation for us when I was in history thing, so I have it.
So I guess there's one.
They will want it. I'll send back a text.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
You might notice this in the beginning of the year too, because we were too.
You know what? I really
Yeah. I'm gonna do it. I started it last year.
Right, yeah, I need
I
it.
really want to try.
Yeah, if we all go, we could share, I think. Shoot, you know, but yeah.
Beginning of the next section.
Wait, so she would, okay, so they open.
Yeah, those guys, okay.
Yeah. Because, you know, the honest answer for most of our geography lessons is, they're really movable.
Right.
But then you want.
Yeah.
And then there is.
That's right. I would like it to be that.
Whatever that was.
Yeah.
That video. This is.
That's what they're making for.
So that's the
Those are resources.
very different.
Actually, I did do that one just first year,
Just
only because of the election.
I got you.
But I didn't. It makes my.
The only thing is kind of.
Well, yeah.
First one. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it makes a lot of
Right, and I
Yeah, but
actually
this
found it really
does, that does
good.
not match.
Resource where, it's foldable, like, and when they fold it all together, like, you could paint it from the ceiling
Yeah.
and whatever.
And I
Like
started
a little
to show up when you download it.
And it was something that it takes one day, and then I had to
When you
go to
download
with
it.
it. I was like,
So
okay.
it's on the
so that's
resource
what I
page.
did.
I did
Last year.
that.
Yeah.
It's on the resources.
And we
Yeah.
we teach together, we go that day.
So when you go to the, to
So this
this,
has a link, it will be.
and then, but this is just like your PowerPoint, but if you download it, then is that when the clickables become activated?
The PowerPoint is made through a process that I described when we actually look at the.
So you're not gonna be able to use this as a clickable?
Well, you use it as a PowerPoint.
Right, yeah, absolutely, yeah, yeah. Okay.
Again, that'd be a great question to ask, and then it saves me saying it.
I'm trying to offload as much of this afternoon.
For the Native American.
Yeah, because once you have it.
I have to figure it out, so.
Yeah.
Watching on a YouTube video.
TV bus.
It's a long.
I'd rather,
Yeah.
just.
Yeah.
That's good, you got it.
I realized that when I was teaching the sixth grade. I taught the sixth grade Giants last year. And I realized I was a lot bigger.
Yeah.
So we don't have one yet to show at this grade level. We're making the big floor maps now, just to head off some of this.
Yes.
One big wall map with the United States. The state borders aren't very useful for, it's very early on. But these are big wall maps, the same company make, this is the Cherry Festival and the Cherry Queen and all this kind of thing that they hang up and down the main street in town. It turns out it's big maps. And in Becky's office, if you're curious, after this is over, we can go over there and open it up again. 10 by 10 foot map of Michigan. And I was just on the back of the election.
No, cool.
But it gives you an alternative to lots of paper that things like that. Mark on the value rates for better yet. Crayola ultra washable.
Yeah.
Do exactly what I'm doing.
Right. Would you order that through the company or through the ISD? I don't know.
If you went to the map, you go to the IS, if you went and saw the map, you would see that it was entirely built from our electricals. In other words,
Oh.
we send the company
Yep.
the maps that we want
Okay.
as a PDF. And it's a kind of a bonus because the technology didn't exist a while back. But you can get 4 or 5 of these things that cost one commercial ball map. And they're marked. I come by this one with this.
The last time it was kind of in the corner, I wonder if I just switch it, like, they can see the screen, when you present, you can see the screen.
Just
Oh, they
information.
see the screen
They see the
as
screen.
we do it there, and then that camera, as you've got it, is just a little tiny inside the corner.
So they see what you're doing.
You can definitely see
Absolutely.
what I'm doing, and I get one of these.
Yeah,
I
right.
get one. If we said big hand on 8, this would be the 1 minute warning.
Yeah, I just, there was a tip where I today, and we talked about it, and where I mean, I did like.
1 minute warning to the remote sites.
That's.
That's what, yeah. I just have you, are you doing?
Well, doesn't matter. That's what- that's what because that's part of the legal hold.
I'm gonna have a. But yeah, I do patient stuff.
We're gonna have a shoebox.
Oh, no.
Where you can. So if you're like a bank.
I think I said like, I'll get those boxes. I can find all the markers not in there.
You know, like,
Yeah.
fillers.
So I'm gonna do the actually the.
Because that's something too.
Right.
Sit that thing
And
on,
without.
because they have so many pencils. And I have a big pouch.
I'll tell them. Highlighter. And
We
dry erase.
sort of like your lunch.
1 minute overtime. This is cutting into the early release.
We're ready to go.
When you go up to the basic giant site, you will see a whole pile of buttons over here, some of which are more active than others. One of the problems with a lot of screens is you don't see the button that's right at the bottom of it because it disappears off the bottom of the screen, but know that it is there. And it is called the Big Ideas Clickable Maps. And those are the ones for every continent. And we will open up a couple of these for right now. Once you get to one of those, actually, I'll go ahead and open one up. What you get is it's easy to get to the North America one. And again, if your screen is a little bit small, you might not see the little scroll bar at the bottom. But the scroll bar lets you move across from one continent to another. And you do have a glick that says they should understand a little bit about the environment conditions and the cultures of Africa. So I'm going to go ahead and open up the Africa clickable for you. And then we're going to come back in a minute or two and do an inquiry activity on that Africa one. The North America one looks like something like that. And when we say clickable map, what it is a whole bunch of cool buttons that are actually color-coded in a way that makes some kind of sense, like blue is water and green is agriculture and brown is landforms and so on. But if you want to see that rock line, there it is. And if you want to know how I constructed the PowerPoint, it is that when you're in this clickable map, you can grab it through your screen capture, you can grab it through a snipper, or you can print it. And it will print what you see. So what you have is an extremely flexible package that addresses one question. In North America, it's region. In Africa, it's latitude. In China, it's population, and so on. So, and then it would have the two rock regions, and you remember seeing that, and it's got the list of exceptions if you want the list of exceptions, and it's got the labels on each side of it. So, like I say, you can construct kind of what you want to see here. This one is still not finished because we have a clear map here, and when a map is completely finished, that clear map will probably migrate down to the bottom here. In other words, we're short about 10 layers on this one. That's because we're waiting for your suggestions. In other words, what would be some other layers that might make sense on this particular map? The Africa one is a little bit further along. And it's targeted at 6th grade because they've been in further along. That 6th grade has been doing this project for a couple of years. We started with 6th grade because that was the completely new geography class. So let me just open up a layer called the Ancient Empire Capitals. And I want to ask you orally 3 questions about this pattern. And I'm doing this deliberately because in that final geeky lecture, we're going to talk about the fact that you store the notion of region, pattern, comparison in different places in your brain. And you have to be aware that some of your students do it differently. And therefore, you have to be able to ask the question the way they get it. So how would you describe the pattern of the ancient capitals that are numbered? And by the way, if I want to know what they are, the key is up there. But this is a topic that the teachers said they wanted to make a quiz out of it some of the time. And so they wanted to have the key taken off of the map so that they could make a quiz like which empire had its capital here. Now, you notice how this is just supporting your textbook talking about Songhai and Mali and Ghana and places like that. So that's what geography is doing in Giants. Very often it's giving you that little tool for a supporting question. Back to the question I was asking though. How would you describe the pattern of ancient capitals, the numbered stars? Most are north of the equator.
They're south of the Sahara Desert.
Most of them south of the Sahara. Since Sahara means desert, we probably don't want to use both words. They are south of the Sahara. They are north of the equator. These are actually causal kind of sixth grade ones. If you were in second grade, you'd start out with they're in a line. And you will have to do this for some fifth grade people. They will not actually be able to verbalize that as they're in a line. I'm going to show you a map where some college students, I've already teased you about that one a couple times, right?
Now, are there rivers by those, I'm assuming?
Sorry?
Are they by rivers? Looks like by West Africa, there's probably by some.
Oh, cool. So then, but see, my question was after the student has described the pattern and then said a little bit more about it. North of the equator is probably a cool little thing. We actually have the equator, I think, completely separate on here because it's absolutely hilarious, even in a group of teachers like this, to give you a blank map of Africa and say, draw the equator. I mean, I've seen the equator just everywhere. It's hard to remember this kind of thing. Sixth grade has a PowerPoint called Where's the Equator? And you learn some clues that it goes right where the Amazon River comes out of South America and so on. So I can turn the equator off. I already did this morning, right? We can't talk about the culture of Africa and then the cultures of Texas, because there is Texas at the right size and right latitude. And what can you say about Africa? Almost all of it is closer to the equator than Texas is. That's not a bad generalization for them to get. Okay, I'll get rid of Texas. That's my take that, George Bush. We said these are pretty much aligned. We said they're north of the equator. And then I would throw it open to the student and say, kind of take a look at these things and tell me what layer would you turn on that you think will do the best job of explaining to me why these things were located where they were, because there's got to be a reason.
Trade route.
Huh?
Trade route.
Trade routes. Okay, so where's the trade routes? Now, the question is, are the trade routes what caused the capitals? Or are the capitals what caused the trade routes?
The resources.
So do you see some resources that I could turn on here that might help?
Well, when you get that trade routes, they pop up.
Loud enough that they can hear you in the remote.
When you hit the trade routes, the resources pop up.
Okay, so I click that. And by the way, do you want that to happen, or do you want us to separate those on
Nice
two?
if they were separate, yeah.
Yeah, so there's an obvious place where we should make a separate button as to what's getting traded on here. And by the way, when you go to My Open Book for a lot of the grades, it's these maps that got put up in there in various kinds. It's not quite so true with fifth grade, because fifth grade My Open Book was pretty far along before this project got started. But we'll fix that eventually. Why do you think they are there? What might be causally related? Rivers, mountains, colonial inroads, ecoregions? And you see what I'm saying is you could actually make this just a group project for your students. Go out on the site, try to come up with the 3 things that do the best job of telling me why these capitals are located not everywhere.
Could it be growing seasons?
So I put the growing season, I don't even remember where the growing season is, and by that way, that's why we don't have 50 buttons up there.
Fourth one up on the green.
4th one up there. Now the growing season is actually an activity map where they can color all the areas that have a growing season longer than 7 months or whatever. Does that help explain? It looks to me like,
Could be that.
huh?
It could be that with rainfall.
So maybe the growing season is related to rainfall. So there's rainfall in January. And you all know that there's this kind of rainy belt around the equator that's around the equator.
The ecoregion.
What's an ecoregion? That's that map right there,
The
that's
one
the
above,
key.
yeah, that
What does that map tell you about the ancient capitals?
they were in the areas that were more hospitable for people.
That they were in the grassland areas, not the desert, not the rainforest. Is there a reason why not the desert? Nothing to drink. Is there a reason why you aren't living in the rainforest?
Sickness, past with sickness, with malaria and other diseases.
And do we have a button that might help us explain that?
You know, the malaria.
I could go over here and I can find malaria. And you could take a look at the crops, because Java is a rainforest crop, but the umpires were based on grain production. You see what the clickable lets you do. And that's really all it's about. It's a foundational thing, bearing in mind that you can take any image you've seen so far and you can print it. Or you can trim it off and put it in your PowerPoint. So do we have other clickables? Yes, we have an Eastern North America clickable, and we have a clickable that I used for the thing that I just handed out to you, which is the Colonies of North America, British French. And I have a teacher's guide on this one. When we think that a teacher's guide is really needed, which means when you tell me a teacher's guide is needed, we put a teacher's guide right in the file here. Some of these others don't seem to need that, but this one did. Don't read the teacher's guide. Just look at the individual maps, which are about the 4th page in. And the map says, colonies in North America, British, French, or Spanish. This is from a clickable file. The clickable file has got every colony, every set of forts, names of forts, where they traveled in, and things like that. Okay, we happen to have 3 tables in our room, so I'm going to make, of these colonies, British, French, or Spanish, just to model the process a little bit, I'm going to make you the first one of those maps, and that's the one that's got a bunch of yellow squares on it. And the table that's at the back corner over there is the second one of those maps, and that's the one that's got a bunch of blue circles on it. And you guys are the third set of maps, and that's the one that has the red triangles on it. And you're not going to have any trouble doing this, but just for the sake of it, why don't you walk through, because you want to find out where does your map show British, French, or Spanish? And then the question you might have to wrestle with is, what is the logic that your people used in picking out where to build their towns? In other words, did they build towns to be ports, forts, trading posts, missions, whatever? So look at yours, yellow circles.
So we're going to demonstrate what prior
Yeah, I was just trying to figure out where they are.
Well, the British are all on water.
Yeah. What else are we supposed to identify besides who we have?
Well, just what the questions are here.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, and you've got the full page version, and that's for a reason. I'm sorry, remote sites. The question was, what else questions do we ask? And the fact is, we gave you 2 sets of maps. One that has full-page map and no text on it, and one that actually has some questions that you could hand to students. You can choose whether you want to do it orally or with the forms.
You go back, pages prior. That's what we showed earlier.
Phil, can we ask a point of clarification?
All right. Repeat, please.
Can we ask a clarifying question? So we're just trying to connect this to where this would fit in these units that we have right now.
Again, this is a foundation activity that supports discussions of which explorers were entering in particular places from different nationalities, what native or indigenous people groups were they likely to be encountering when they get there. Later on, we're going to have maps of the indigenous people next week, next meeting.
Okay.
And then finally, where is conflict likely to occur between these groups? So now, if you ask me exactly where it is listed in the boundary of this, I have to admit I don't know.
It'd be a nice conversation to talk about where would people put that.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Okay.
And I was actually going to ask that question about the last one too. Now, I'm hearing some interesting comments in stereo, and I really think that some of the comments that are here really ought to be part of the whole group here. You were asked to identify your people, and you probably didn't find that hard, but your students might, because this is where they are actually being given that knowledge. You have it as prior knowledge. But if you have any multilingual students in your class, either Quebecois coming in here from Canada or Hispanic people coming from South America, it might be a good time to empower them a little bit and have them explain why their group was where they were. In any case, there's lots of ways to approach it. The more difficult question is this question of colonial strategy. Like, what did they seem to want? And we are trying to tilt a little bit against that simple-minded little matrix that says, as something we downloaded from the internet, coming from Facts on File, no less, that the Spanish were here basically to kill and steal. And it was exactly that blunt, you know, that they just thought the native people were there to be killed or enslaved. And that is, how do we say it, racist? It's a lot more complicated than that. And one of the ways to get at the complexity is to have them do an inquiry about that complexity. Is it perfectly obvious that any one of these groups really wanted to control ocean ports? And which group would that be? That the British people's, their location of their ports, is it all of their ports, or are there a couple exceptions? And it might be worth noting where those exceptions are. And again, we're going back to this draw a line around a region map, that all regions have little exceptions in them. And it lets you re-say that. which group seems to want to have controlled river transportation by placing their trading posts along rivers and lakes?
French.
And again, we kind of know that. Your student hopefully will discover that idea rather than being told to write it in a matrix. And the Spanish people really had a very complex pattern, right? It's a little hard to categorize it in any one of these because they have some ports, that Manila galleon trade. They have some missions. They have some farming communities. They have some mining communities. They were trying to control it far more complex, partly because they were here a lot longer than some of the others. So they had a population of 500,000 before the first English colonies showed up. And it took a long time before English colonies passed Santa Fe in terms of total population. And we pointed out that we've tried to give flexibility here. There is a map that has all three on at the same time, but you could have the students draw a line around their own little region, what we've been talking about, drawing a line, or you could have them do it on this complex one, or you could take a look at a PowerPoint that we did that's called European Colonies PowerPoint. And this will do what I've just been doing orally. So let me just kind of race through it. You will get one of these three maps. And so you could just show this as an easier way to explain it, you know. By analyzing your map, you're going to try to identify colonial strategy. Oh, by the way, what do we mean by strategy? And let's put it on the word wall here. And the region that it was claiming, we better put the word region up on the word wall here. In other words, we are introducing some geographic and historic terminology here at the same time. And then you're going to compare your maps a little bit later on. I'm going to illustrate it with one that isn't one of these three groups. It happened a little bit earlier in history, but I'm just going to illustrate the process of what you want to do. Starting around the late 800s, the Norse people of Northern Europe. By the way, Viking isn't even an ethnic group name, right? You knew that? Gee, I'm from Minnesota. I guess we knew that. The Norse people went Viking. Viking is a verb, and it's called to travel in order to trade. And the Norse people went Viking starting around the year 800 when their population expanded very rapidly, and they invented a boat that would let them travel in pretty hostile places. So they're way ahead of the Portuguese in terms of inventing new boats that let them cross the ocean, unlike a lot of your textbooks. And they started sailing across the Atlantic. They landed in Iceland about in the year 800s, and in Greenland in the 900s, and by North America here. There are a number of other sites that are possible Viking sites, including some that are pure mythological snake oil, like Alexandria, Minnesota. But we don't think that there were just one or two or three. And in fact, on Greenland, we know that there were at least 20 of these sites. So what I did was I just kind of made a inference that they tended to choose peninsulas. They were used to living on a peninsula. And what's good about living on a peninsula? I mean, you kids know what a peninsula is, right? A little piece of land stuck out in the ocean. What's good about living on a peninsula?
You can protect it. You can protect it.
Yeah, but you gotta be loud enough that they hear you, not me.
Can't protect it.
Yeah, she says, the advantage of a peninsula is your enemies can attack only through one door. It's like being in a bedroom that has one door. You know which side to sit there with your little Glock and your, you know, because we all have got concealed carry permits. So I'm like that. The records say they chose that. So what I did was I just came up with a couple more peninsulas that are possible sites. They are in the archaeological record. They are contested, but it'll help me explain the process. We're pretty sure that they did that. They would be easier to defend. And the next job is to draw a line around all their sites to make a region map out of it. So there is the Viking region of North America. Okay? Now you could do the same thing for your region. In the interest of time, I'm assuming that everybody knows how we'll do that, and we just go on like that. Go. Draw lines around your regions. When you're done with your map, you have a job. and it's called Compare It with Other Maps. And here again, Giants is not telling you how to run your classroom. You might choose to do what I just did, make groups, and have them actually send ambassadors to each other to say, you know, we need to sort out what's going on in such and such a place. But, or you might want to just give them the map with everything on. There are a lot of ways to approach this, but the goal is to try to identify where on that map these different groups are likely to come into conflict. Okay? So, and we know that they might come into conflict if they're both on the same river, and they might not come into conflict if they are close but on opposite sides of a big mountain. Okay? So, there's in the interest of time, I've already drawn these maps for you. Would that be the map you drew? Or would you make it one region?
I would have done one.
And how would you lump them together? Because there's a big space in between.
Up along, well, probably just went up north along the coast.
Yeah, see, there's one huge problem. You remember the game we were playing at the beginning? Why didn't you put your, because we had that great big enemy fort over there. And until 1863, I'm looking over here, until 1863, the French had a huge fort at Louisbourg, right there. And they had settled all this territory, you know, this is Evangeline, you know, and the Acadians, who then became the Cajuns when they moved down to Louisiana. And the Quebecois in here. So we had a very solid French presence right here.
I'm thinking in terms of if you show the students your Viking one that you just
Right.
drew, they're going to draw a one-piece region.
That's it.
because that's what you did.
That's it. And again, this is the teachable moment in a sense, that it's not wrong to be a one region. It's just one person's interpretation. And there may be another interpretation that is more useful in understanding history.
I don't know if fifth graders would also include the entire Hudson Bay
Right.
either. I don't know if fifth graders would include the entire Hudson Bay as part of that region in the north. They would just go along.
Right.
You'd have to teach them
That they might even just call that one an outlier and just have a
Right.
region here.
Right.
And by the way, what was this region called?
The northern cold.
No, the Hudson Bay Company.
So
At some point, geography is the science of the ridiculously obvious. So anyway, for the remote sites, the question was raised, how many regions do we put on one of these maps? And the answer is, it is a judgment call, and a big objective is that students are aware it's a judgment call. They should question the judgment. That is, they should interrogate the map to figure out what the logic was there. So what country was that? You see, the PowerPoint does this, so we could actually do this as a PowerPoint kind of thing. What's their strategy? It seems to be ocean ports of some kind. And again, I think it is probably useful to identify 3 Spanish regions, because in fact, there were 3 Spanish regions with very different personalities. That the California region was very much mission-oriented. We owe it to the heathens. And the Mexican one was a far more complicated mercantilist kind of thing. We are gathering gold and silver to trade with the Philippines. This was complicated. Does this make sense about giving you the tool to either raise the complexity or not? Okay, then I'm going to put all 3. Tell me where they're going to fight.
So when you look at Florida and what would be, Hispaniola at the time, you're making that one region?
Sorry? Yeah, Florida is.
Florida, okay. You're considering that one region?
That's an interpretation. And again, I keep wanting to underscore that the real goal is for the students to realize that anytime they look at a colored map, somebody made this interpretation, whether that's the ISIS territory in Syria, or whether it's the Republican vote in Texas, or whether it's the pollution. Anyway, when they see a colored map, somebody went through this process. They made these judgment calls. And we're trying for the students to kind of do that far away, not to be talking about possible contamination of well water in Michigan until they've got the skill down, and then we can apply it to things that are more controversial. And also that they interrogate the map, that they say, wait a second, you didn't show that fair. But having said that, there were a lot of fights down here. They don't tend to be in our history books very often, because the history books tend to be written by people who were up here in Philadelphia and Boston and so on, where the bigger population was. But there were a bunch of fights down here. Were there any fights in, say, Western Pennsylvania near Fort Duquesne and the Erie Canal and Buffalo and things like that? Were there any fights up here? Yeah, that's the battle that ended essentially the French and Indian War in Louisburg and falls in 1763. In other words, your students can predict the locations of the events that later come in to the historical narrative. Or they can look at the map afterwards and say, oh yeah, that made sense why they'd be fighting there. And that George Washington was out here surveying and ruining the fact that his boss had a red coat and he didn't want to be walking around in the green woods with a red coat and hoping that everybody around him was colorblind. Is that enough about this particular package of material? That it's not a lesson unless you want to make it a lesson. It can be a support for several other lessons, or given the PowerPoint and the handout sheet, it could be a lesson, or it could be a take-home activity and come back and do a persuasive writing activity in your ELA class. Tell us why we ought to worry about a battle in this particular, or conflict in this area and what the conflict might be over. Any other suggestions how you might use a package like this?
You can use it as your hook to your lesson. I do a lot of flips.
Yeah.
I'll send my kids home with tutorials at night, and so you could just kind of give them that and say, what do you think this is and what's going to happen? And
You come back and give me a 3-minute briefing
sure.
to the Senate here as to where we ought to deploy some troops here. Because in fact, they were raising that question a whole lot. Incidentally, can you see the proclamation line as to where, the British are not supposed to go west of this line? In other words, there's a lot of historical facts that can be teased out by constructing a map like this from scratch. And I gave you several versions of it, but you don't have the version in print. It has all of these colors on it. That just happens to be one of the layers. I did give you the version in print that is the one that just terrifies me. And that's the one that teaches off this version and have you memorize the names of all of these, So I gave it to you because it does exist. These are real places. They are, in fact, somebody else's list of what were the important places within each of these colonial domains. And we've already looked at Africa a little bit, Dave, and teased out the ancient capitals. So we've been out on the clickables. This thing will be a more friendly clickable at some point in time, but we develop these clickables in Adobe Illustrator, and it tends to be very unfriendly, and it just piles the buttons up in the left column in text. And then Dave works his magic, and all of a sudden the buttons are color-coded and they're laid out in a sensible way, and so on. So all you have to do is get down on your hands and knees and worship and beg him to get this one ready.
No, Phil.
Actually,
I do it because I drink.
It's ready somewhere. We just we don't remember exactly where this one is. Where might they be in conflict? This thing actually lists 6 places where the conflicts did materialize. Remote site, I hope you can follow this because I'm about to have everybody stand up for a minute here. We meaning the Michigan Geographic Alliance, has identified a big idea for each continent, and that became the basis of the big idea clickables. And in the continent of Africa, the big idea is latitude. We chose Africa and latitude because Africa happens to be exactly on the equator. Half of it is, latitudinally, it extends about the same distance south as it does north. And therefore, things that are related to latitude, like the locations of ancient capitals, tend to be symmetrical on opposite sides of the map. And in fact, there is a row of them up here. And then at the same latitude down here, there are some, like Great Zimbabwe here. There aren't as many, because Africa just isn't as fat down here. What else is highly symmetrical on opposite sides? There's a great big desert up here, and a little bitty desert down here. And the question is, how do kids remember this desert? And the answer is, you may have to do this, because I always have to do this when we're doing a teacher workshop, and this particular presentation comes up about this time of the afternoon. And it says, if you had a globe, and you really should have a globe for this, so treat my head as the globe. The sun is shining down, right here, and my ear doesn't hardly get any sunshine, but the top of my head gets a lot. The equator gets the most sunshine. We all know that. And when you got sunshine and you heat the ground up, what happens to the air? It gets warm. When the air gets warm, it goes up, right? Hot air rising. When it goes up, it does what? Makes a cloud, starts to rain. So let's have the clouds go up. This is yoga in the afternoon. Clouds are going up. Now let's imagine that we were all standing in line, because the equator is a line. I'm not going to waste the time to do it because you're going to be clumped. So imagine that you're just all standing in line and you're looking at the back of the head of the person in front of you and you're all doing this. Where's the air going to come down? In other words, the air that I'm throwing up over me, is it going to come down on the person in front of me?
What do you say?
Not a chance, because that person's throwing air up too. And all the way around the equator, it's going up like that. Which is why you got 180 days. So it's got to come down someplace. And one of the things we've learned by sending space things is every planet that has got an equator, a rotating ball, and an atmosphere has got bands of what the equivalent of rain, rising air at the equator and settling down some distance away. Some distance away is a variable. It depends upon how big your planet is, what the thickness of the atmosphere is, how hot it is, all of this other kind of thing. But I'm throwing this up and it's coming down. Okay, let's do it. Okay, and it's up rain, down desert. Up rain. It helps explain something that is puzzling for some kids, especially at 5th grade. If you're telling me the equator is the hottest place, how come the temperatures are higher in the desert? And the answer is because heat is not temperature. Heat is a combination of temperature and evaporation. And the equator, when you add those two together, is more. But the temperature is higher in the desert, at least in the summer. So up, rain, down, dry desert. Now the loaded question for you as adults, if the globe is getting warmer, will the desert be pushed farther away from the equator or closer to the equator? I'm throwing up this air harder. farther away. Now make your mental map of the world for a second and think of places that are just a little bit farther away than the desert. I have two of them right here. One of them is called South Africa, and they have had a drought and an unusual number of fires for about the last 20 years. And one of them is all the way across up here, and they have had a drought and an unusual number of fires. And let me save Syria for just a second, because California is just past the desert. And what's happening in California? As you can see, even the day before yesterday, looking at the moon here, because the dust was coming over here and the moon was nice and orange. And what's happening in Australia right now, because they're at the same latitude. They have a catastrophic drought in both Perth and Adelaide. Oh, and by the way, Chile in South America, skinny little desert. But the desert is moving away from the equator, and the wine regions of Chile, in other words, global climate change is not just temperature. Now, why do I do this? Is that latitude is really important. Because how far you are from the equator will decide whether your air is going up or coming down, whether you've got a lot of rain or a desert, or you're a little bit further away and you have a desert only in summer, and then in wintertime it comes back. You know, and California has been like that forever, right? Has a hot, dry summer and a cold, rainy winter. And a cold, rainy winter is 2 months long in San Diego and 4 months long in Los Angeles, and 6 months long in San Francisco. But it's there for a predictable reason. Now, why do I say that? Because latitude matters. And do it 3 more times so that you really woke up, because it's going to get real geeky for just a minute here. It's going to get real geeky. Does that help you see the map of Africa real clearly like that? And let me just minimize that long enough to show you a couple pictures of Africa. So it's a 4-minute PowerPoint that is not on your packet. This is for teacher adults. This is a class of 28 students that got a presentation about the environments of Africa. Now, the presentation was real, had about 50 pictures of each place. I'm going to just show you 3 of them like this, because we use photos to help kids understand what's going on. So, kids, this is a rainforest, which means it rains, and it's got a lot of trees. Geography is the science of the perfectly obvious. It rains almost every day. Trees go really big in a rainforest. If you live in a rainforest, you're probably going to build your house out of wood because there's lots of wood around there, and you're probably going to eat monkeys, and you're probably not going to have a camel, and you won't see any penguins around, and all kinds of things that are related to that. This is on the same continent, about 1,000 miles away. And the first one was where the air was going up, and the second one is where the air is coming down. Hardly ever rains here. Here's your science fact. And by the way, this is a 3rd grade click. They should know this already. Trees need water to grow. What would you use to build a house out of? And I'll make that even simpler. What would you not use to build a house out of if you lived here? You're probably going to be building your house out of stone or adobe or something like that. In other words, lots of aspects of life depend on where you are. And in Africa, there's a very clear latitudinal pattern. Throw the air up, have it come down. Geography is the science of the obvious. We just have to figure out what's obvious because it's different in different places. Pictures are real useful. And the Giants package is going to have lots of PowerPoints that have lots of pictures in it. We're gathering them from all over the place. And my open book is kind of cool because you can click in places and get picture quizzes. And our vocabulary words often are picture cards and things like that. Pictures are really great if you ask questions about them, like what do you build a house out of when you live here? But unless you link them to a map of some kind, kids are not going to remember where that desert is. Are we okay on that? No problem. Maps are a little more abstract. It's harder and more important to ask good questions. I had 28 students. I showed them that map, typical textbook map. I said, this green areas, and now this is part of the lecture about the rainforest and so on. Showed them the green area. And I showed them the desert area, and then the grassland in between, and the savanna in between that, and where the fires occurred. Said, study the pattern of environments over the break, and we went home for Thanksgiving. And then I gave them a blank map, and for some reason, my blank map isn't showing up on the PowerPoint right now, and just said, divide this blank map into several regions. There are their answers. Now, you're going to have a hard time reading the answer because it's black and white and they just wrote the words on it. So what I did was I took their answers, scanned them, and then colored them according to the terms that they used. You see a problem? You see a wake-up call here? That's the map they studied. And the Sahara, the biggest, driest desert in the world, became a farming region on all 5 of those maps. The rainforest, the jungle of Africa, disappeared completely from a quarter of their maps. The human brain does not store visual images like maps accurately. Unless you make them do something else with it. If you make them do something else with it, they can remember that map, but the brain doesn't do it. Why is this a wake-up call? These were 28 college sophomores taking the only social studies class they were going to get prior to teacher certification in a state that I will not name. And the question is, of course, how are you ever going to understand why Pharaoh built something like a pyramid and what Carthage was all about, and Mansa Musa, what the slave trade was about, Mandela. Are you going to understand malaria if you don't have a rainforest in your mental map of Africa? Are you going to understand desertification if you don't have a desert in your mental map of Africa? How about Darfur? How about Boko Haram? How about the Somali pirates? How about... You see what I mean about a wake-up call? Well, in that case, and by the way, let's lighten it up a little bit, take it away from current event issues. I'm going to hide a $50 bill. You're allowed to be quiet now.
I will say,
How many times have you seen this one?
It took me 3 before it sank in, so you might have an aha yet.
Yeah. There are lots of clicks that this deals with. In order to understand how kids remember a map and why we design maps the way we do, it helps to understand how the brain processes visual information. And oh, by the way, this is going to relate to how you learn how to read, because reading fundamentally is a geographical act. And I got a PowerPoint to explain that, so I won't go any further than that at all. I'm going to hide a $50 bill in this room. So there is the map of the room, okay? And it's got 9 tables on it. Each table has a different color. It's got 9 books. The books are all identical. This is a very simple room, you know. Real rooms, the books would be different colors and different sizes, and the tables. Simple little room, okay? There's the door to the room. That's kind of important. And I hid the $50 bill under that book, okay? And this is you. Yeah. You know, you are this perfectly spherical entity right here. You now have 20 seconds to decide how you're going to remember where this $50 bill is. And then you've got a minute or 2 to talk to the people next to you to see if you have put it in the same place and what clues you're using. So think all alone for a while. How are you gonna remember where that $50 bill is? And then talk to the person next to you to see if you have the same clues. I will guarantee you probably don't.
It's already happening, Phil.
Hmm?
I said it's already happening. That was the conversation.
What's that?
They have different, what they're looking at.
That is the middle table there.
If you want to remember right now, how do you remember it?
So did you have the same clue as the person next to you? Out of curiosity, how many have it? Well, no, I think I even have that as part of the PowerPoint here like this. How will you remember where it is? How many of you said it's on the table that's near my right hand? That proves only one thing, that you are adults and you knew it had to be more complicated than that. But there is a hinge point somewhere between second and third grade, actually between age 4 and age about 10. Piaget had the stages right, he had the ages all wrong. Somewhere between age 4 and age 10, there is a shift from having an egocentric framework of the world to a more geocentric or allocentric framework of the world in geek talk. And I try to avoid as much of this geek talk as I can, but just to say, if this were a younger group, we would have some people voting for it. And in fact, Dave will testify to the fact that in groups of 30, we often have 1 or 2 votes for that. How many voted for the orange table? 1, 2, 3, 4.
Well, some people may have thought about it too. Okay, in my right hand, what color people?
Turn the volume up a little so they can hear you.
Some people, like too, at our age, could think of like several things. Okay, if you're my right hand,
Yeah.
they pick the color on the table. Like there's more, and it all goes together.
Yeah. And once again,
It's just a one thing.
I am sitting in a room full of professional symbol manipulators, to think of not too exotic a word, right? That you guys have been dealing with abstract symbology of various kinds in language and in mathematics for your life. And you've chosen it as a vocation. That is not an accurate description of 100% of the population, even at your age. So if you filter that out and realize that, you can tell yourself several different clues here because you can code switch. And I will get to this diagram in a little while in your handout sheet, because what we've learned since we've hooked up brain scanners is that you've got some separate networks in there. Oh, and this is going to make some people, not in this room, but some people in some education departments are going to get real irritated when I say there is no such thing as a visual learner. It just doesn't exist. And yet, you will have some pedagogical snake oil salesman busy telling you that we've crafted a curriculum for the visual learner. Just please have your little BS meter go up at least into the yellow zone when they say that. There is no such thing as a visual learner. It's way more complicated than that. And even people who process information preferentially, visually, go through separate networks. So how many said it's in the middle of the first row? We had a couple people on the orange table. Middle of the first row? How about the book that's in the front middle of the table? And again, you guys are multiple voting because you've got multiple networks that you can access. Your kids don't. Until you push them, very often, 4th and 5th graders don't access multiple networks. They access one, and that answers the question. And we got a little bit of research to back that up, about 4,000 professional articles somewhere. The spoiler alert is human brains do all this at the same time, but they are usually unconscious. If you want to read a nice, cool book about that, I think Daniel Kahneman has one called Thinking Fast and Slow. What are you hoping up there? Oh, yeah. Okay, I'm taking you to another room. There's the door. I walked you over right here. Unfortunately, you wind up underneath that thing. I can't move that, can I? Oh, I can. So you're right there. And just to make life a little easier, I numbered 6 of these tables because that's typically what people will vote for. In a group of 30, I will have vote for all of those. How many of you would say it's on table 1? And now you're only allowed 1 vote. $50 rides on this vote. You're allowed 1 vote. Number 1. Okay. I'm going to auction off table number 2 right now. Anybody going to give me a bid for table number 2? Do I hear a bid for table 2? Anybody? Give me a bid for it. Anybody want table 2? No, it's on the orange table, people, anymore? How about table 3? Okay, middle of the front row, right?
If you look to right, it's the only one that the books don't line up,
Aha.
which is what I was.
And table 4. Okay, and table 5? And table 6? Why? Feeling lucky. And by the way, he has just illustrated the point that I was going to make, because in fact it is in table 6. But the people that vote for table 6 tend to be 2 groups: feeling lucky and ones that really overthink the question. Why could it be table 6? Because on table 6, the book is on the table in the same position that the table is in the room. If you remember in the previous room, it was down here, and it was like table 4, but here, which meant the book was on the table in the same position that the table is in the room. This is one of the problems with standardized testing, is that standardized testing will often have an answer that somebody who really overthinks the question will think of, and the test designer never thought of. And by the way,
NAPIAN step, that one's good.
yeah. And by the way, I probably run this little game for 1,000 teachers in 9 different states, and I can count on the fingers of 2 hands the number of people that voted for this one, and half of them voted for just that reason, that it just has to be more complicated than I'm thinking of, and the other half had thought it all the way through. And maybe you did think it all the way through that far, I don't know. Yeah. And I like a little honesty here. It's like which table has the treasure, it depends on which mode. If you think it's your right hand, you're going to vote for one, and a lot of people will. Color association tends to be more common among females than males because females have better associative memory than males do most of the time. But our vote was 3 females, 1 male going for this one. Sequence tends to be more commonly males than females. Some of this research is being done at Michigan Tech University at Houghton because they were having a problem that people were not passing their entrance exam, and the fewer females were getting into the engineering program until somebody realized that 4 of the questions on the entrance exam were biased against the way a female brain is structured, biased against a particular brain network that is linked to the X and Y chromosome in different ways. In an analogous position, I'm using words like sequence and analogy and things like that, but it'd be better to define that later. This PowerPoint has one job. It is to say that the human brain has multiple parallel networks for processing spatial information. They operate more or less simultaneously for everybody, but you become consciously aware of one of them, and which one you become consciously aware of depends on a lot of things. How old you are, whether you're male or female, how many years of schooling you have, what direction your language reads, whether you were raised in a particular family with a particular income group. I mean, it really depends on a lot. What's backing this statement up? About 4,000 research articles. And I don't remember, have we talked a little bit about articles that we publish and where they're cited? I'm blanking on whether we've talked about it in this room.
I don't think you do. Just that you get paid more. on the
Well, this little diagram, this little diagram was in an article that I published back when, you know, geeks at universities have to publish articles in refereed peer journals. This is in your first set, second last page. And we're going to take a tour of your brain in a minute here. The article got published about 8 years ago. And it is still being cited, and I belong to a organization called ResearchGate that sends me a note every week saying, Phil, you know, they want me to pay to get a premium membership in this thing. And so their teaser is, Phil, people are citing your articles in a number of different places. Click over here for the premium membership and we'll tell you who is doing it. And I don't have time for that, but they give me the numbers. So this particular article was read and cited by people, 6 people in the last week. 2 from Japan, 2 from Brazil, 1 from Turkey, and 1 from Lithuania. Over the course of a year, it gets somewhere between 200 and 300 citations. And I can count on the fingers of one hand the number from North America. This is mandatory part of the curriculum in China, Japan, Korea, and Brazil right now. And this is the first time you've ever seen this diagram, right? We are just not paying attention to this research in North America. And then we're asking questions like, how come people from other countries are scoring better on certain kinds of tests? It's because the tests are testing knowledge, and the knowledge is coming through visual information. It's coming from graphs, it's coming from photos, it's coming from maps, it's coming from numbers and letters. Is that enough of a teaser to say, you know, if that isn't, then how about this? That what Marianne Wolf is doing, because 2 of her kids are dyslexic and she wondered why, and she went and got a PhD in the neuroscience of reading and now leads the biggest lab in North America about dyslexia. So I can ask a very simple question. Do you have a fight going on in your own school about how many minutes you get to use for social studies as opposed to reading and math? And
Yep.
okay, the next 20 minutes, 15 minutes, I'll cut it down in the middle. The next 15 minutes is a little bit of ammunition for you to use in that fight. Because reading and math are not linked to social studies just through the filter called you need some content knowledge in order to read a paragraph. It's also filtered through, it's how you see the paragraph on the page. It's how you see the letters, it's how you see the graphs and so on. So how does this apply in the classroom? I'm going to go to second grade for a minute here. This is a typical map. How many of you have seen a map like this? You know, I don't want to pick on that particular one because I've got a collection of about 50 of them from different textbooks. Like, okay, I will pick on that one because it's particularly beautiful. The major publisher, I won't tell you where the publisher is. I'll just say millet is really important. Remember when we were doing Africa and all of the ancient capitals were millet growers? So if you're going to study this map, you ought to know where millet is. So the question is, how are you going to remember where millet is? And the answer is, if you thought it was table number 1, you would remember it's near the gorilla. And if it was table 2, you'd say it's associated with a light green color here. And if it was table 3, you'd say it's between the camel and the oil well. And if it's table 4, you would say it's inside Nigeria in a particular position, you know, within the whole frame of the continent. And if it's table 6, you'd say it's like Goa, which is another one of the ancient capitals that's in a similar location over here. You see what I'm doing is those books on tables access the same brain networks that kids use to read a map. Good enough? Go on.
Somebody grunt.
Huh? Go on. So people unconsciously encode locations on maps, but they do it with different rules. And if they do it with different rules, they're going to remember different locations, especially if the map is not well designed. Now, when I say well designed, that map, and here I'm speaking as somebody who was hired at one time or another by every major publisher to be an author and decided not to do it for any of them. I'd rather work with things like My Open Book than with Pearson or Glencoe, because they weren't paying any attention to us. They were paying attention to the focus groups. And if I took you two maps side by side, and this we did in New York. We worked with a high poverty school in Harlem, 9 kindergartens and first grades, and the reading scores went from 57 to 94, even though they wasted 40 minutes a week in geography. Because these were geography lessons that were designed. And one of the lessons was a read about loud, you know, we're going to read about camels. Now you're thinking, what are people in Harlem interested in camels? And the answer is real obvious. If you walk into the Bronx Zoo, the very first thing you see is the camel display. And it's not only you can see the camel, you can ride it. So those kids loved camels. They wanted to read about camels. We said, fine, read about camels. We just want to add a map. Just like we're asking you in 5th grade, go ahead and read about, you know, John Cabot and the Proclamation Line and all this. Just add a map. So is that the map I added? And the answer is no, although that's the map that wins the focus group for the publisher, because if you were asked as a parent, which of these maps do you think your kid will like better, that one or that one? Which one's going to win? The pretty one. And you need to know that about publishers' maps. They are chosen by focus group. It's just like Coke and Pepsi. We all know that Pepsi wins every taste test. If it's Pepsi wins the taste test, if the taste test is to give you a sip blind and then ask you which one do you like better, Pepsi always wins. If you wait a half hour and say which one was more satisfying, Coke always wins. But Pepsi wins the initial taste test every time. So we call them the Coke and Pepsi taste tests. And we're saying that first map was Pepsi and this map's Coke. If that helps you remember it, fine. If not, forget it. And just say a well-designed thematic map plus a task. And the task is one that you guys were doing a few minutes ago with the British and the French and so on. We would ask the students, draw a line around the camel house. And they might have one camel house or two, and we'd tell them, your map is just great. It's different from theirs, but it's just great, as long as they did something like that. Right? So this is Harlem. These are these students. They've done their read aloud, and they've drawn a line around the camel region. And then we pat them on the back real loud. We say, hey kids, you just made a regional map of Africa. Even though Africa is big and is way, way far away from Harlem here, you kids are really smart. You can tell me something about Africa without ever going there. Now the question is, if you were in 2nd or 3rd grade, what question do you ask? And it's not a rhetorical question. I want you to think about what question would you ask after you've patted them on the back. I mean, we just said this a little while ago. Maps are harder to read than photos. You need to ask good questions about them. Let's ask a question. Huh? I'm asking what a teacher should ask when the kids have made this map around here to help them remember this map. I probably went one step too far there, but
Why is it in the northern?
that is a great 6th grade question where we do world geography and we ask questions like that. Why? But how do you build a scaffold for that 6th grade question? What do you ask in 2nd grade where they are not into scientific causality?
Where do camels like to live?
Huh?
Where do camels like to live?
Where do camels like to live? And I'd say that's a 4th grade question because that requires them to already know a lot of locational words. But in second grade, they are just learning the locational words. So now what do I ask?
What about desert and water?
What
Huh?
type of animals
Something
live?
about desert and water.
Again, I say that's a sixth grade question. That's a causality question.
Just ask what you notice.
Loud enough that they
What
hear
do
you.
you notice about?
What do you notice about camels? They're all in a bunch here. And then you might want to even be specific. Do the camels like to live in the north part of the south part of Africa? But what do they have to know already? In other words, Giants is trying to build a K-8 scaffold. Any school should be thinking about a K-8 scaffold. You have to think about a K-8 scaffold in fifth grade because you can't trust the people that were teaching first, second, third, and fourth grade to have built this scaffold for you, right? You can't trust that they've built the scaffold you need. So you have to be able to phrase this kind of question too. And of course, what do they need to know is they need to know what's northeast, south, and west, which means our Harlem school had a whole lot of lessons about naming our walls. And then we do a Simon Says thing, stand up, everybody face north. Simon Says, everybody point to the east wall. Everybody line up on the west wall to go to, in other words, this is classroom management in first grade using direction words. So the direction words become part of their hardwired brain network. You're shaking your head. What?
Because I had this conversation with my fifth and sixth graders last year, and they asked me which way is north, and I said, well, where we're sitting right now, it is this, you know.
Yeah.
And they said, well, how do you know? And I said, because I know where north is in relation to where I'm at in this room. And he said, one of my students said, well, what if I go out in the front of the building? Where's north? I said, it's still the same, depending which way you are facing. But if you're standing in the same way that our classroom is, it's still that way. Well, what if I go to my house? And how do you know?
And
that's fifth and sixth grade.
And I think that is a fabulous example, better than what I was thinking about already, of a basic principle. The window for hardwiring this network in your brain is between the ages of 4 and 7. If we knock geography out of our curriculum in kindergarten, first and second grade, it will be harder to learn this. But in our Harlem class, one of the teachers did it just brilliantly. They walked in the third day of us naming our walls, and I'll show you some more pictures about the Harlem class in a minute. They walked in the third day of that, and they said, you know, kids, I haven't told you everything about what's going on with northeast, south, and west. That wall really isn't north. And of course, in first grade, this is big news. Teachers changing their mind. What's going on here like this? She says, here's the thing about north. North keeps going beyond the wall. Now, we named north, but it's kind of interesting. There is not a culture in the world that has 3 directions, 5 directions, or 6 directions. They all have 4 or 8. It's kind of hardwired in your brain to begin with, but that gets me ahead of my story here. That's the next PowerPoint a little bit later on. But you were dealing with people who had gone past the window of opportunity to refine this network in your head. And it made your job a lot harder, you know? They were puzzled now. North is an arbitrary convention. There's no such thing as absolute and relative location, but there's a glick about that. You know, there's nothing but relative location. What do you think? They'd say, here's absolute location, latitude and longitude. What is longitude? It is an arbitrary measure of distance, east or west, of a line that a group of astronomers drew through their own observatory. That's as relative as you can get. And yet it is used as an example of absolute location in the TCI curriculum. Well, curriculums sometimes are wrong. Especially if they were written before the brain scanners got hooked up to this thing. Thank you for the illustration. I'm stolen that, and I'm going to use it the next time I do this.
I did not know how to explain
Right.
that to him. he kept saying, how do you know?
How do you know?
I just know that,
And the answer is
you know?
we chose to name a part of the world that doesn't seem to move when the globe spins, and that gets really complicated. So we started it right away with naming our walls, and then the teacher that brilliantly said, North keeps going beyond the wall, and then asks the next question. If I could take the wall away, what room would I be in? And then if I could take that wall away, where would I be? And 20 minutes later, those kids had arranged a model of the Empire State Building, a model of a statue in Central Park, a model of the Statue of Liberty, and they had arranged them in proper order if we kept going south farther and farther. Now, Piaget would say they cannot possibly deal with that kind of abstract topological relationship until age 10 or 11. I am here to tell you that I watched 5 high poverty first grade classrooms do it. And by the way, their reading scores went up from 57 to 94, partly because once they learned directions, they stopped reversing letters, because the only difference between a B and a D is the direction it faces. The only difference between an N and a U is the direction it faces. And knowing directions gave you a vocabulary to discriminate letters. And I didn't think of that idea at all. I stole that from Marianne Wolf, who's a reading specialist. We did, and the kids were really proud of, doing a whole lot of position word activities like this. Here's the point to be made for 5th and 6th graders. If you have learned the camel map of Africa, you already know the map of the desert, Islam, part of the colonial map, a good part of the trade map. I'll leave it at that because I've got one more PowerPoint to show you yet that takes a tour of your brain over here. And then one more. Is it enough with this one to say, will you concede to me that it is true that we've got 7 or 8 parallel networks in our brain, and it is possible to think of a person that can think of only one of them at a time? Because that's everybody. There is no such thing as multitasking. You can task switch. Anybody teach in multiple languages? You got Hispanic kids? Yeah. So they code switch much better than we do. I had 4 people that were teaching Hispanic there. This is the message coming out of Michigan Tech University, and people like Nora Newcomb at Temple University and Janelle Hutton-Lockridge at the University of Chicago. Every kid can learn how to do every one of these better. That's part of our Giants curriculum. I would not be involved in Giants if Giants wasn't willing to take this gamble that we actually can improve reading and math scores by doing good geography lessons. If Giants weren't doing that, I would be working in another state. I have already worked in 34 states. Oh, and I love it because I'm reading all these articles on the subway. We already talked about that like this. And they give me invitations to go talk about seminars. You know, this PowerPoint actually exists in a lot of different languages because I've let other people pay for me to have a free trip to Moscow, Tokyo, Seoul, Sao Paulo, Amsterdam, London, never Lansing. You know, that this morning I was corresponding with a guy in Shanghai and a woman, Sonia Castelar, in Sao Paulo. They've got 2 doctoral students that are developing curriculum in Brazilian Portuguese. My Brazilian Portuguese is 4 words long. This is what's sad. Will you agree with me? Kids don't just get information from a map. And this is a direct quote from the Common Core, which says, students should do a close reading of a text and combine it with information they get from a graph or map in order to construct an argument. That is a direct quote from the Common Core. We need to do close reading of text, but we get information from a map. Will you agree with me? Kids don't get information from a map. They have to do close reading of the map, and we have to give them those skills. That's what the next PowerPoint is. Spatial Reasoning 101 for teachers. A crash course on your brain. I promise you it will be no longer than 10 minutes long. We are going to wander around, but you might want to take notes on this diagram. When you are done, you will not master this subject. And that's the diagram there. Sorry about it, guys. I keep forgetting to hold it up. This is the brain in the middle and the diagram around the edge. Watch this be a 20-second survey of educational psychology. Immanuel Kant, back in the 1700s, said, we have built-in ways of organizing information, temporally, spatially, causally, quantitatively. We have a Kantian curriculum. We have history teachers that deal with time, and geography teachers deal with space, and science teachers deal with cause, and math teachers deal. Okay? And then the clouds came. That was in the 1700s. Cloud number one was Rene Descartes, that says the mind and the body are separate, and they called it dualism. It's the first of the isms. And then there was Skinnerian behaviorism, right? B.F. Skinner, and we're going to do the behavioral thing. And then there are these other isms that I simply copied out of an EdPsych textbook. What do they have all in common? There's one thing that every one of those believes. The human brain is a blank slate upon which we construct knowledge. And Immanuel Kant said that's not true. So does all the brain scanning research since 2004. We do not have a blank slate up in our head, and we build knowledge in it. Now, unfortunately, brain science has been a buzzword, and you will require at least 2 glasses of Chardonnay or 3 glasses of a wonderful brew from Holland, Michigan called Dragon's Milk. And if you give me that, then I will go into more detail about the following slide. Otherwise, just please bear with me. Gersmel's first rule of educational materials is if it uses the word brain friendly or brain science in it, it probably isn't. Because we really haven't known this long enough to do this. And I'm a little bothered by how much pedagogical snake oil there is out there. You know, the Dale Cone of Learning, the best practices, you know the buzzwords. There are outfits out there that actually have the word research in their name. You know, blank, blank research associates. And then we go out and do teacher workshops like this. Go Google them in Google Scholar. Find out how many articles they've published in refereed journals. That's all I'll say about that. If we look at the brain scanning research, the peer-reviewed articles, first of all, we're going to find most of them are in French, Italian, or Chinese. And we can get English translations up because the labs are much bigger. Her lab is 8 people, and Stan DeHaen's lab in the Sorbonne in France is 62 people. The research is happening overseas, but pay attention to the research, not the advertisement that says Kant was right. And this is Steve Pinker. He is the head of the psychology department at Harvard. That's probably a pretty good pedigree. And he says, the human mind has built-in conceptual frameworks that organize our experience, space, time, so on. Lots of talk about time because historians have made you into good time people like this. I'm a geographer, I'm worried about space. So, and by the way, this has won 2 out of the last 4 Nobel Prizes, so it's not fringe stuff. I have used these magic words and you have these magic words, and I now have about 7 minutes left to make a tour of your brain, so that gives me about 1 minute for each one of these words. I have done this step for you. These words are neurologically as well as logically linked to prepositions in your brain. In other words, if you have a spatial sequence network, this and then this and then this above your left eyebrow, the word between is probably stored up there in your head. And that would be about 90% of you. There is no such thing as left brain, right brain. by the way. Raise your right hand. It's so 20th century. The brain is a little more complicated than that. So a tour around the brain. You have a comparator in your brain. It compares sizes and numbers of things. It is located above your left ear for about 95% of you, but 5% it's on your right ear. Your brain's just different. Okay? And tell me about this room. Is it a big room, small room? Is it a bright room, dark room? This is a hard question because in fact, the brain is a comparative thinker. And if I rephrase the question, compare it to your bedroom, is it bigger or smaller? Is it brighter or darker? It was dirtier or cleaner? I won't ask that question here. It might be different for different people here. So let's compare the peninsulas. In second grade, we would say, how big are they? You know, the UP is smaller than the LP. In fifth grade, I might ask, or fourth grade, we are asking the question, which one has more people? That's a number question. In seventh grade, or even in sixth grade, we're going to be asking which part of that has more people. Draw a line around the populated region over here. And probably in high school, we'd ask a gradient question. How fast does population density change when you go north or west from Detroit? Do you see what I'm saying? That it gets real sparse real fast going this way, and this way, it kind of takes a while. But gradient's an important idea. So's number. These are separate networks in your brain. Every kid has them. Every adult has them. If we had a lot of time, we'd talk about how fast you react to a tiger, because if you saw a black and orange striped thing flash in the corner of your vision for 1/10 of a second in the lower right corner, your muscles would actually react and you would start running. Except you probably wouldn't actually start running. You would just, your muscles would react. If you saw the same thing flash in the top of it, you wouldn't, because your brain has already said, it looks like a tiger, but tigers don't fly, so it can't be a tiger. Don't worry about it. But if it's down in the lower part, way back in your history as a hunter-gatherer, if you didn't start running right away, you might not have survived to pass your genes on to the next person. Encourage children to make comparisons. Let me do a real quick adult comparison to say this is not just children, this is adults. 22,000 civilians were killed in Afghanistan, 46,000 in the conflict in Pakistan. Which place is more dangerous for a civilian?
It depends on the overall population.
And that's what we want fifth graders to start to ask, that if you're asking for a comparison, you want to make it a fair comparison. And they need to know what questions to ask. And population is one of them. Probably even more important is how many years are we dealing with? Just because I happen to put this column first, you know, if I had complete control of the technology, I would have used years first, because years is second. And what can I do when I know the number of deaths and the population? Is I can do a fifth grade math activity and calculate now which place is more dangerous for a civilian. Now it's an easy question to answer, right? I guarantee there's a how built in the next one, because I always have these blue boxes and then the blue boxes disappear. What's under there? Think about it for a second, Americans. We get from television an image that people in Pakistan and Afghanistan are hiding in the corner of their houses because the bullets are flying around. But your chance as a civilian of getting killed is twice as great in Chicago as in Afghanistan. Like I say, this is not just children. It's encouraging adult voters to make valid comparisons. Where are the crime rates worse? That showed up in the last election here. Region, we've already talked about. This is what they're going to do in third grade. They're going to take that and draw a line around a group of it, and they're going to name that Michigan's Pine Belts. And I've finished regions. Have kids draw a line around. If there's a region on the map, tell them to draw a line around and then to write a sentence describing where it is. Michigan Pine Belts are in the northern half of the UP, the Lower Peninsula. Pattern is a little more complicated, and it's a different network in your brain. So there's earthquakes. Is there a pattern? And there are a lot of pattern words, so I'll give you one. An even pattern means it's spread evenly around the map. No. How would you describe the pattern of earthquakes? Yeah, it's a nice 7th grade answer, and it's a good answer. It's a little bit ahead of me. It works pretty well. Earlier grades, we tell them one of the pattern words you want to look for is bunch or a line. Are there bunches of earthquakes or are there lines of earthquakes?
Lines.
And all I'm saying right now is pattern language is an acquired skill. And they need to look at a lot of maps, but one way to remember a map where it would be very hard to draw a line around the region of earthquakes. But there is a pattern of earthquakes, and that's a separate brain network. It's pretty far away from region. Region is in the back right-hand side of your head, and pattern is kind of up here above your right ear. They need to learn words. And a geologist would see an on-echelon pattern of deformation. So anyway, she said ring of fire, and that works a little bit later on. Have kids give names to the patterns they see. If their names are really unique, you might suggest an alternative, but the trick is to get them to turn the pattern into a word in their head. Can you remember the shape of Italy better or worse than Bulgaria? What word helped you do that? Yeah. Hierarchy is something inside something else, like Escanaba is inside Delta County, inside the UP. Guess where I did this workshop last? But it helps them a lot if every time you name a place, you name something that's inside. Takes you another 1/10 of a second often. George Washington went to Fort Duquesne inside Western Pennsylvania. And that's all I'm going to say about that. Have kids name an area, big area that something is inside. It will increase their chance of remembering where that is. Association, this will take just a little bit longer. I have 2 maps here. I have moved to Michigan fairly recently. I understand that Michigan is one of the few states in the union that have 2 F words. And one of them is associated with these gas wells up here. What's that word? Fracking. I came to Michigan with a pretty good geology map of North America in my head. And one part of that geology map is that Michigan is a kind of a bullseye pattern of rock ages. So a spatial association are things that go together. What do the gas wells go with? The orange rock, does that make sense? In other words, where are people going to be politically arguing about fracking sometime in the future? Oakland County, Macomb County, and Ottawa County. And there are people right now down in the little town of Dorr that are sitting out there fracking wells, riding the sly right now. This is spatial association. The trick is to use our clickable maps because they're designed to help you understand spatial associations. Camels associated with Islam, associated with, we've already done this, right? It's easy to do, but it's hard to do. The more good mental maps you put in your head early, the easier it is to learn a new map. It didn't take me 10 seconds to learn the fracking map. It's up there where the population density is low enough that the people weren't going to object when Halliburton came and said, we've got jobs for you. But in Oakland County, believe me, they don't want people fracking wells next to their lake. Now that's an adult thing. We're trying to train kids to be spatial associators, which means, how do I say this nicely? Don't use that chapter of the MC3 curriculum because they're teaching basic skills. No, this is in 6th grade, right? They're teaching basic map skills with maps of Levi jeans, Coca-Cola, and UFO sightings. I want to teach the basic map skill with a map that's worth something, and that would be a map of camels, or gorillas, or rock ages in Michigan, or pine trees. Better yet, walnut trees. Walnut trees in Michigan are a spectacularly good predictor of crop yields. If a walnut tree grows on a site, you can grow really good corn there. The problem was the Potawatomi Indians lived in the places where walnut trees grew. They actually sold walnuts to other tribes as far away as Illinois. And when Europeans came, they said, oh, walnut trees are indicators of good cropland. Please go away, Potawatomis, go out to Oklahoma. It's why we got little bitty Potawatomi reservations and great big Ojibwe reservations in Michigan. But that's a 4th grade lesson here. Sequence is where things get messy here, because that is the map of Africa that my brain will remember. And it will remember that because I'm a male and because my ring finger is really long. And that meant that the prenatal balance of chemicals in my mommy's womb allowed me to develop a very elaborate sequential memory and a very poor associative memory. And as a result, I can remember that map. I cannot remember that map except as a consequence of that map. Now, I put those two up there for one reason. That is 4 of the 65 research articles that back up that assertion. And what do you get out of those titles? And I could have done this all along. I could have put up the titles of research articles that back up these statements every step of the way here. So, spatial aura is how close are you to the smokestack? That's table number 1. Spatial analogy is, are you like someplace else? Like Muskegon is a lot like Buffalo. They're both on the east side of a lake, and therefore they're both going to have a lot of snow in them. And all 8 of these are a different network in your brain. And they're like the muscles in your arm. You've got a lot of different muscles and they do different jobs. You need to strengthen the weak one, not cater to the strong one. I'm actually going to skip these principles because you guys really know them. Because I have one more 1-minute PowerPoint for you. And it talks about reading and math. And you can get this from me. Spatial thinking is about shapes and sizes and where things are and how they're arranged. Like a book has a specific arrangement. To read, you have to know your upside from your downside first. Reading letters or shapes. And one form of dyslexia is the inability to separate curved shapes from straight shapes at a particular age easily. And that is spatial pattern, right? A line as opposed to an arc. One form of dyslexia is direction. One form of dyslexia is mixing up the spatial sequence. But direction is here. Shape is in the back of your head. Sequence is in the front of your head. We got 3 different kinds of dyslexia already, and I'm not even halfway through my thing. Adjectives are associated with nouns, like the treasure is in the orange table. Words influence nearby words. It's a white house, not a white lawn. And text is a spatial hierarchy. You probably remember where something was on a page. Like it was up in the right corner of the page. I just don't remember which page. I don't remember the fact. And math is a spatial skill. Numbers are spatial shapes. Number line has a specific direction. Numbers occur in spatial sequences. Subtraction is a size comparison. Division is a size hierarchy. And geometry is all about shape. In other words, a good geography lesson should be a math and a reading lesson, and is in many studies around the world associated with higher reading and math scores. Tell that to your administrator when they want to cut your minutes in order to focus on more reading strategies. That's what the purpose of these PowerPoints were. I'd be happy to send you the PowerPoint if you need them. But my guess is you probably do need these every once in a while in your school, right? Are they trying to carve your minutes away from you? And with that, we're early.
Dave, do you have anything else?
When we come back next month, we're going to be covering Unit 3, which is going to obviously start getting into some of the regional differences between New England, Middle and Southern counties, which should also be familiar content with you. But the first thing I think we're probably going to ask you guys to reflect on is going to be, how did it go teaching, Units 1 and 2, or however far into that you are. So just be thinking ahead in terms of, I'm going to be asked to do some reflection when we come in next time about what you might choose to share during that opening part. And we look forward to seeing you next time. Becky?
I have nothing else unless we have any questions from the remotes. Nothing on the chat, Dave?
Not seeing anything in the chat.
And I gave you a one-page activity that we didn't have.
Bill, hold on. Alicia, go for it.
Go for it.
We're good here in Bay Arnack. Thank you, guys. It was a good day.
All right, Phil.
Okay, I just handed you out a one-page activity we didn't have time for, but when you talk about the Columbian Exchange, this is reflecting some new research about where different crops were first domesticated and how they became part of it. So, give you a little more update now. And then eventually we're going to put this into my open book. With that, I'm going to thank you guys.
Have a great start to your school year, whenever that may be. And I will take care of it.
Hear about grade 4's October date.
Yeah, we're working on it.
Okay, thanks. Thanks, Phil.
Auf Wiedersehen.
Auf Wiedersehen.
Anybody wants it?
Yeah, I'll
Yeah, give me that, but thank you.
Thanks.
I can move on.
Thanks.